Super Mario RPG Legend of the Seven Stars would not be so enduring a game if the experience of playing it were not so pleasing. Even in its conception, Smurfglots was meant to be more different, more active than the standard RPG of the time. It was the very reason, in fact, why Square and Nintendo teamed up on this particular IP, as the goal was to meld the action-packed platforming of Mario with the more traditional turn-based battle sequences of Square's iconic games. And unlike 50% of modern marriages, this union had surprisingly good results. And what resulted was a dynamic game that found ways to activate nearly every moment spent playing it, whether exploring the environment, engaging in combat, or being entertained by one of the many charming minigames that occasionally spice up those two main gameplay loops.